welcome. And we're going to do a book review today. And the book review kind of deals with a topic that I've explored for, probably the past month or so. That's been brought up on the channel before, which is the Fred Hampton killing by the Chicago Police Department. And accurately, you would be able to say that it was a murder or assassination. And I think it is important given the past few years, and it's not as much of an issue in the public mind as it was certainly from 2014 through 2017. But the issue of police shootings of people that were not necessarily a threat to them. Now, I would say that some of the cases that were brought up in the past few years, I would say yes, there was justifiable shooting of the suspect. But if you explore the topics of the Fred Hampton shooting, I think you would have to conclude that A, Fred Hampton did not present a threat to the police officers present and raiding his apartment or the apartment of the Black Panther Party on West Monroe Street in Chicago. Second of all, you'd have to conclude that there was probably some sort of premeditated plot to incapacitate him and make him ripe for some sort of violent end. And I would say yes, it was murder with malice aforethought, as they would say. And, this kind of shows the FBI for who they are. It wasn't the FBI who carried out the murder, but the FBI did supply the intelligence as far as where Fred Hampton was living, and they did target him according to COINTELPRO. So I put down some of the facts in this presentation, but I think I will be ad-libbing some of the issues that seem to crop up as we go along. So the main figures here, of course, you do have Fred Hampton, who was from this suburb of Maywood, Illinois. He protested in high school for a black homecoming queen and more black teachers. Now, from what I understood from the book, he had his high school, East Proviso High School, or Proviso East. They actually had some sort of rule that only a white kid could be homecoming queen, only a white woman. So, yeah, that was something that he protested, and he was used as kind of a mediator by the local school administrators in order to prevent racial tensions at the high school. And in fact, if you read through the book, he was sort of trusted by the civic authorities and Maywood in general. I believe he was involved in some sort of plan to bring a swimming pool for some black children, a public swimming pool for black children in Maywood. And then he joined the Black Panther Party in 1968 when he was 19. And that I think is when he started to really go towards this, this ultimately his tragic end, because the Black Panther Party at the time was becoming a part of this radical culture of people who were rejecting authority. That authority would include the police and the legal system, and they had a number of incidents in Chicago as well as across the country where you had violent confrontations between the Panthers and the police, as well as the Panthers and other various organizations or criminal gangs in some cases, including some documented in the book, such as the Blackstone Rangers, which is a famous Chicago gang of mostly black people. The Young Lords, those organizations, they were kind of viewing this radical new politics as sort of a threat to them. So another key character, and this is the author of the book, is Jeff Haas, who was born in 1942 in Atlanta, middle-class Jewish family, although, a little more upper-class, middle-class. And he had domestic workers as a kid who were black people. And seeing segregation in the South did teach him that there's injustice to be overcome. Now, if you read the book, Jeff Haas is kind of I would say he's a complicated figure for me, because what he did in the terms of this trial, you have to give him credit. He was paid very, very little in order to pursue restitution for the families of Hampton and the other casualty, the fatality in that shooting, Mark Clark. And he had to go through several years of very, very meager earnings in order to accomplish what he ended up wanting to accomplish. He went to University of Chicago Law School, and he was a classmate of Bush's Attorney General, John Ashcroft. Now let's read a little bit about his philosophy, because this is why I say he's a complicated figure, because he is a lawyer, but if you look at the way that he lived his life, I would say he's not really somebody who believed in the rule of law, okay? And he said, as for the personal implications of being a revolutionary, I, like other mother country radicals, as we whites called ourselves, had to figure it out. Tennis, okay, but who had time? Tasty food, a hard one to give up, and maybe okay if not overindulged, not too expensive, and everyone got a share. Potluck's preferable. Maintaining relationships with your parents, the radical movement line was maybe, but my gut said try. My parents were more accepting of me than I was of them. There was a distance, but I didn't burn my bridges. The weathermen who had taken over SDS, that's the Students for Democratic Society, and with whom we had the closest personal relationships, pushed the line. Smash monogamy, they cried, arguing it was the source of patriarchy and women's oppression. Yet the alternatives of many partners or serial monogamy had their own problems. I can't say how much we were guided by our theory and how much by our hormones. Sex, no limit. It was free, but of course there could be an emotional toll. Type, heterosexual, not preferred, but allowed, and most of us indulged heartily. Living in nuclear families? The line said no. Kids and parents benefit from a communal setting. I had no kids. For a while, we helped with Dennis's kids. That was another attorney. And I did eventually live in a collective. So, yeah, he was basically a communist. He talked, if you read the book, he mentioned several times how they subscribed to the teachings of Chairman Mao at the time. Now, I think you could be forgiven a bit, because at the time, the results of the Cultural Revolution, I think the Cultural Revolution was still in full swing. All the other abuses of Mao were not necessarily well known at the time, like the Great Leap Forward. But yeah, I would definitely say me and him probably would not get along. Now, if you look at Fred Hampton's own ideology, he says this, and we have this video to play as well. It says, we don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We say we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism.
I want you to know that I want you to think. If you ever think about me, and if you think about me, niggas, and if you ain't gonna do no revolutionary act, forget about me. I don't want myself on your mind if you're not gonna work for the people. Like we always did, if you actually make a commitment at the age of 20, and you say, I don't want to make that commitment because of the simple reason that I'm too young to die, I want to live a little bit longer. What you did, you did already. You have to understand that people have to pay the price of peace. If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you dare not to struggle, then goddamn it, you don't deserve to win. Let me say peace to you if you're willing to fight for it. Let me say it in the spirit of liberation. I've been gone for a little while. At least my body's been gone. You ain't got to repeat after me. At least my body's been gone for a little while. But I'm back now, and I believe that I'm back to stay. I believe that I'm going to do my job, and I believe that I was born not to die in a car wreck. I don't believe I'm going to die in a car wreck. I don't believe I'm going to die from slipping on a piece of ice. I don't believe I'm going to die because I got a bad heart. I don't believe I'm going to die because of lung cancer. I believe that I'm going to be able to die what I was in the things that I was born for. I believe that I'm going to be able to die high off the people. I believe that I will be able to die as a revolutionary in the international revolutionary proletarian struggle. And I hope that each one of you will be able to die in the international proletarian revolutionary struggle, even be able to live in it. And I think that struggle is going to come. Why don't you live for the people? Why don't you struggle for the people? Why don't you die for the people?
All right, so bear in mind those words as we go through some of the facts that come to the fore. So another person, key figure, is Ed Hanrahan, and he was appointed state U.S. assistant or U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Illinois before he was elected Cook County State's attorney in 1968, and he approved the raid on 2337 West Monroe Street, where Hampton was killed in his sleep, or so most people would say.
The immediate, violent, criminal reaction of the occupants in shooting at announced police officers emphasizes the extreme viciousness of the Black Panther Party. So does their refusal to cease firing at the police officers when urged to do so several times.
This is 2337 West Monroe, described by police as a depot for Black Panther Party arms and ammunition. 14 State's Attorney's policemen, led by Sergeant Daniel Groth, found out indeed it was a depot for weapons. After a 15-minute gun battle that cost Illinois Black Panther Party Chairman Fred Hampton his life, Sergeant Groth described the raid as 15 minutes of hell and a miracle. A miracle because not one policeman was killed, a miracle because not more policemen were shot. The firing stopped only when the occupants realized their arsenal was no match for the police arsenal, an arsenal that included a .45 caliber submachine gun and 2 shotguns.
What they didn't understand, and what Edward B. Hanrahan doesn't understand, and what Richard Jolivet, his chief assistant, didn't understand, and what those police officers who put those 2 bullets in the skull of his head as he lay asleep didn't understand, and what Richard Nixon and his assistant lackey, Mr. Mitchell, don't understand,
is that you can't kill Chairman Fred.
Right on!
What they didn't understand is that anyone who would try to kill him is and shall ever be an enemy of the people. And that whoever would do that can only be appropriately called not a person, but a pig. What they didn't understand when they did that is that pigs die, but Chairman Fred lives.
All right, so you have some of the flavor there for the times, and I think when you go through what happened when, the aftermath of this killing, the killing of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, you have to bear in mind all of the surrounding circumstances. So here is the account of the raid. It occurred on 2 a.m. on December 4th, 1969. At 2337 West Monroe Street in Chicago. There were 2 fatalities, Hampton and another Black Panther Party member, Mark Clark. Now, what people forget, okay, this is not in defense of the police officers, but people should bear this in mind, is that it was not something that occurred in a vacuum. It's not as if the police suddenly decided at this moment to target the Panthers and kill them. About a month earlier, 2 police officers were murdered in Chicago, John Gilhooly and Frank Rappaport. And the person who killed them, who was himself killed in the shooting, was a guy named Spurgeon Jake Winters, who was a former Black Panther. Some accounts say that he'd already left the party before this incident. Other accounts say that he actually was still part of the movement, and there were actually news releases that kind of praised him for what he'd done. Now, this would suggest that the Panthers, at least some of them, were in a mindset of actual insurrection against the U.S. government and law enforcement agencies. So let's keep that at the back of our minds as we keep going forward. Now, there was a question as to who gave the information as to where Hampton and the other Panthers were. And this kind of became a topic of contention because originally, while the first trial was going on, which we'll get to the first trial, I'm not going to go too far in depth into it, the Chicago Police Department and their lawyers, the police officers and their lawyers, they claimed that a person named Babatunde Omowale Babatunde had been the informant. However, he'd already died by the time the trial got underway because he attempted to bomb a train in downstate Illinois in 1970. As it turned out, and this was later revealed, and they go in depth into how they needed to reveal this. The real informant was a person they'd suspected the entire time. The lawyers, Haas as well as Flint Taylor, they'd suspected the whole time that it was William O'Neill. And here is a account by him.
We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you remember I said with the last words on my lips, that I am a revolutionary.
My recruitment by the FBI was very efficient, very simple, really. I'd stolen a car and went joyriding over the state limit, and they had a potential case against me, and I was looking for an opportunity to work it off. And a couple of months later, that opportunity came when FBI agent Roy Mitchell asked me to go down to the local office of the Black Panther Party and try to gain membership. I just began to realize that the information that I supplied leading up to that moment had facilitated that raid. I knew that indirectly I had contributed, and I felt it, and I felt bad about it. And then I got mad. I had... and then I had to conceal those feelings, which made it worse. I couldn't say anything. I just had to continue to play the role.
All right, well, he killed himself apparently by running in front of a car in 1990. So we don't know to what extent William O'Neill was involved with the FBI afterward. However, most of the accounts, including accounts in this book as well as elsewhere, say that he also helped drug Fred Hampton that night by slipping barbiturates into his food, meaning that the FBI had a person on the inside who may have been directed to incapacitate him and therefore render him helpless as people went in and tried to quote-unquote arrest him, and he ended up getting killed. This is, if you really look at it, it's a very strong piece of evidence that the FBI and the police department never really intended to take Fred Hampton alive. Okay, there was only one Black Panther who claimed to have fired shots. His name was Louis Trulock. They go through a lot of his testimony in the book as well as some of his accounts, and he'd also been probably the weakest link among the Panther, I would say the Panther suspects, because he kind of ran away several times, tried not to appear on the witness stand. But ultimately, even with Louis Trulock having admitted to shooting, the fact is that only one round was ever discovered to have come from a gun owned by the Black Panthers. there were over 300 rounds fired in total, meaning that the police basically peppered the entire apartment, as can be seen from the photo. And this is essentially evidence that the Black Panthers, despite all of this rhetoric that, you know, they were armed and they were dangerous, and the FBI and the police department had to fear from them, and of course there was the previous shooting of the month before that, they did not put up an active resistance during the raid, meaning that the police did lie when they said that it was, you know, basically 15 minutes of hell and they feared for their lives. It appears as if most of the people who were captured in the raid were basically caught unawares and completely they were completely unprepared to defend themselves and fight back against whoever was raiding the apartment, whether it was the police or somebody else. And the ballistics also showed that Fred Hampton apparently was prone on the bed, which is not a position of resistance, when he was shot. And there were actually accounts that he was heard to have been shot long after the police had secured the apartment. Okay. So now we get into the area of the trials that went into trying to ascertain whether Fred Hampton was actually murdered by the Chicago police or not. Okay, now we get to the trial of the Black Panther Raiders. So who were the people on trial? It wasn't the Black Panthers themselves. It would be basically these prosecutors such as Thomas Hanrahan, some of the FBI personnel, okay, the police officers themselves. Those are the people who were on trial. And damages were demanded initially from the Justice Department and, of course, the FBI, because there was evidence of FBI involvement through the COINTELPRO program, which we've discussed on the show. And initially, okay, and Jeff Haas goes through painstaking detail on this, the FBI refused to reveal whether COINTELPRO sources had been used in order to pin down Fred Hampton on that night. So let's look at some of this. So the first trial began with Judge Joseph Perry. You can see him on the background screen over here. Okay, he basically, his trial. If you read this book, this is, I think, the most shocking part in the book for me. Okay, reading as a critical person, somebody who's not necessarily terribly sympathetic to the Panthers, but, you know, I think that obviously reading the account of the raid, it's clear that the law enforcement people were acting in a very unprofessional and even criminal manner. Judge Perry actually behaved almost like a government of his own. He repeatedly said things that seemed to suggest that he didn't care whether these police officers were liable or not in the murder of two people at this apartment. And in several instances, he actually seemed to be acting in order to help the police officers escape any responsibility. He was basically weighing on the jury, excluding evidence that was important for the jury to be able to rule on whether the officers knew that Fred Hampton had been a threat or not. And actually, there was a part where Jeff Haas actually objects and says, well, they're not getting they're being denied a fair trial. And Perry actually said, well, you're damn right you're not getting a fair trial. So I would say that this was really the crux of the battle. And you know, it took a very long time. Apparently it took 18 months, although from the book it sounded like it took longer. It took until 1975 for the trial to begin. And also, you know, that's about 6 years. Then it took until 1978 for the appeal to be held. And in that case, that was also very interesting. And I don't know if you guys are interested in that part, but Tom Fairchild, Luther Swiger, and Wilbur Pell were the judges that were brought in to rule on this. And I know some of you might think, well, this isn't the important part. Well, yes, it is. Because Wilbur Pell, who was the third judge on the panel, who was, considered a conservative for those times, a very law and order type person, he actually had been a retired FBI agent, meaning that he was prejudiced going into the trial. He should have probably recused himself. Wouldn't you think? He actually went into the trial, the appeal trial, with a conflict of interest. So you already had all of these basically prejudicial rulings in the trial that exonerated the police officers. And then in the appeal, you actually had a judge who failed to disclose that he had been an FBI agent. I found that pretty unbelievable. But the ruling in the appeal court, if you look at this person in the middle, Luther Swiger, it was pretty convincingly in favor of overturning the lower court decision, disqualifying Judge Joseph Perry, the initial federal court judge, from hearing the trial again. And eventually, I believe he was restricted from hearing many other types of trials because of his conduct during the Panther inquiry. And they actually awarded damages to the Panther plaintiffs rather than to the defendants. That was also pretty shocking. I forgot to mention in the first trial with Perry actually awarded damages to the police. Can you believe that the police and other people, the county of Cook County and city of Chicago and the FBI, they were awarded damages after, basically they hadn't suffered anything except for, having to go through the litigation. Whereas the other side, they'd lost two people. Whether you like Mark Clark and Fred Hampton or not, they had been killed and very likely killed without having resisted arrest or anything. And then the appeal decision, which was ruled on by this I believe it was federal judge John Grady. $1.85 million was awarded to Hampton, the Hampton and Clark families, as well as some other victims on February 28th, 1982. So, what is my takeaway from this? Okay, remember what Fred Hampton said at the beginning. He wanted to die basically in the struggle for international proletarian revolution. And his group of people, the Black Panthers, maybe not him personally, there was actually no evidence based on any source that I saw that he was involved in any violent activity. And according to some accounts, he'd actually discouraged some of the more crazy stunts of some of the other Panthers, including the informant William O'Neill, such as building an electric chair and creating these explosive devices. Nevertheless, when you're involved in the Black Panthers and you're involved in all this revolutionary activity, and you say that you want to create a violent struggle in order to overturn, basically Western society and the capitalist system, well, some would say that you basically got the fate that you asked for. But this is also important. We still live in a country that we say that the rule of law is important. And I think we would all have to agree that if we start to give people the type of treatment that they would do unto others, then we're not really living in a society of laws. Okay? And I'll phrase it again, okay? Treat others as you would treat yourself. That's kind of the golden rule. But we don't visit proletarian justice on people here in the U.S. We don't have people who we see as targets. We don't look at them as people that the government should take out because they happen to oppose its policies. Even defendants who are violent criminals, people who have assaulted people before, they're still entitled to due process. There's the Miranda rights. These things were settled by the Supreme Court. All of the appeals that were in this trial were settled by the federal courts. Okay, and in fact, the unjust first trial was conducted in a federal court. So those thinking, well, Fred Hampton, revolutionary, he was trying to overthrow the government, communist or whatever. I hear all that. I don't believe that if Fred Hampton would have survived, I would probably have never supported the policies that he was going for anyway. But that doesn't justify drugging him, raiding his apartment with a machine gun, which is, nowadays any police squad that would go in with a machine gun would probably be, all the officers would be fired, submachine gun, but it's still automatic fire. And they did in fact deploy automatic gunfire, over 300 shots. That's kind of insane. I think most reasonable people, whatever your political persuasion, would say that's pretty excessive. And then on top of that, this was an apartment that they'd gotten information from an FBI informant, and that FBI informant had drugged the suspect and maybe even other suspects. So we're basically talking about the FBI setting up a U.S. citizen for murder. And that's not really consistent with the perspective of the U.S. Constitution and the legal system. That's kind of the type of government and the type of justice that isn't justice at all. It's really just a government that seeks to protect itself by destroying its enemies, whether by lawful means or otherwise. So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this book review. I would say yes, you should read this book. I don't think you necessarily have to agree with Jeff Haas or with Fred Hampton to understand the main message of the group of the book, which is that every defendant in the U.S. does have the right to a trial, has all the civil rights of anyone else, even if it's a person who could be seen as an enemy of the state by the FBI or whatever. If the FBI behaves that way, it's not really being part of the system of justice. It's being part of a system of persecution. And that's about it. So yeah, go pick it up if you are at the library or you just want to buy it on Amazon or on Barnes & Noble. And also please like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to my other channel, Razor Ray Special Cuts, as well as to me on SoundCloud, BitChute, Minds.com, and Gab. And I'll talk to you guys later.